Thank you for being here with us today. Welcome, I'm Sasha Killewald. I'm a research professor in the Survey Research Center and the Population Studies Center and the director of the Stone Center for Inequality Dynamics. I'm delighted to welcome you here today to this session of the ISR Insight Speaker Series. The Insight Speaker Series is our way of opening the doors of ISR and sharing the innovative work that our faculty are doing to understand and improve the world around us. With over 300 affiliated faculty, ISR research spans an incredible array of topics from wealth inequality to racial justice, political opinion, aging, and health. You can find a full schedule of upcoming Insights talks at our website, isr.umich.edu. You can also find their recordings of previous talks, and today's talk will be recorded as well, so feel free to share it with friends and colleagues afterwards. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Robert Manduca. Robert is an assistant professor of sociology and a faculty associate with the Stone Center for Inequality Dynamics. His research asks why some people and some places are more economically prosperous than others. His recent work has examined the role that national policy decisions play in determining the economic viability of cities and regions and the consequences of rising income inequality for social life in the United States. His work has been funded by the Washington Center for Equitable Growth and published in peer-reviewed outlets across multiple disciplines, including a forthcoming article in the American Journal of Sociology. In this talk, Robert will examine the extent of tax-based fragmentation in the United States, identifying metropolitan areas with the largest disparities between jurisdictions. He will also discuss municipal tax havens, which are municipalities with extreme concentrations of wealth that essentially act as tax shelters for their residents. Robert will give his presentation, and then we'll have time for questions and answer afterwards, so please hold your questions to the end. And with that, please join me in welcoming Robert.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming out today and for the invitation to present this work. Thank you, Sasha, for this generous introduction. And I'm really excited to talk about this project on tax-based fragmentation. I should note, this is a joint project with Brian Highsmith and Jacob Wagoner, who are a legal scholar and a political scientist, respectively. To give you an overview of where we're headed, I'm going to start by talking today briefly just about the role of local governments and property taxes in the United States federal system. Then I'll describe with some examples and conceptually how local government boundaries create fiscal inequality through tax-based fragmentation. I'll then talk a little bit about the data and methods that we're using to try to quantify and study this across the country, and then present some findings, first just on sort of the extent of tax-based fragmentation across different metropolitan areas, then some consequences for individual jurisdictions, and finally some linking this to local government revenue and sort of what are the revenue consequences of this configuration. So to start, to just give an overview of local governments in the United States. So in the US, local governments are a very important part of our system of government. They provide lots of different public services, including most notably schooling, especially K through 12 schooling, public safety, transportation and infrastructure, meaning both roads and public transit, but also things like sewer systems and water, and lots of other services. And in total, local governments make up about a quarter of all government spending in the US. So in 2017, which is the time period I'm going to be focusing on, that amounted to about $1.9 trillion. And this is comparable in amount to the total spending of all state governments combined, about $2.1 trillion. And it's about half as much as the federal government spent in that year. And those percentages are fairly similar today. So these are a big component of the system. And to provide all these services, local governments have to generate their own revenue. So one thing that is somewhat unusual about the way the US federal system works is that local governments have to generate a lot of what's called own source revenue. I mean, revenue that's raised based on taxes or charges on economic activity and economic resources that exist within their spatially delimited boundaries. So about 80% of all municipal, meaning city and town revenue, about 67%, 2/3 of all county revenue, and about half of school district revenue is this own source. And the biggest components of this are property taxes and then charges or fees, where a lot of the charges and fees are going to different types of utilities. And as I mentioned, this is something of an anomaly among high-income countries. So just as one point of contrast, in the United Kingdom, local governments exist, and they only generate about a quarter of their revenue. So in the US, it's more like 2/3 to 80%. In the UK, it's about a quarter. And the rest is transfers down from the central government. And what this means for the United States is that the level of services that a local government can provide is closely linked to the affluence of its residents, and then in particular to the amount of property wealth that they own. So as an illustration of how this can work, we can go down to Texas, and specifically to the Dallas metro area, to two cities, Highland Park and University Park, that are collectively known as the Park Cities. And the Park Cities are enclaves within the city of Dallas. So they're completely surrounded on all sides by the city of Dallas, but they're separate legal entities with their own local governments and their own budgets. And they're, by most accounts, like pretty desirable places to live. So this was a profile from a few years ago describing Highland Park in particular. And as it says, it's no secret why it's so attractive. It has one of the lowest property tax rates in the country or in the state of Texas, yet it has one of the best school systems in the country, and it has excellent emergency response services. So it has low taxes and excellent government services. And that sounds pretty great. You might wonder, how is it that Highland Park is able to do this? And to answer that, we can look at geography. So this is a map of Dallas County. You can see I've circled in red the two Park Cities. This big blob is the city of Dallas. You can see it surrounds them on all sides. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a point to this map for every house that is valued at more than $1 million. And so if you look at this, you can see that there's a lot of expensive houses in Dallas. They're clustered in sort of this north central portion of the county. And then many of them are specifically clustered within these two cities, within Highland Park and University Park. And in fact, within Dallas County, the Park Cities account for 1.3% of the population, 1.3% of the population, but almost 40% of the houses worth more than $1 million. And so this means that even though houses in the Park Cities are taxed at 0.23%, they're able to generate more revenue per capita than the 0.78% tax rate being charged by Dallas proper. So this lower tax rate, because the tax base, the base of taxable wealth is so large relative to the rest of the metro, even by paying a lower tax rate, they're able to generate a lot of revenue for their services. And my co-authors and I argue that the Park Cities are an example of what we call tax-based fragmentation, or the unequal partitioning of taxable wealth across jurisdictions within a metropolitan area. And because US municipalities have to generate so much of their revenue locally, fragmented tax bases mean that there can be massive differences over very short distances in things like the level of government services and also the level of taxation that's being paid. And there can even be an inverse relationship between tax rates and government services, as I just described. So, in general, I would say most people expect that, you have this trade-off where you can pay higher taxes in order to receive more services. But under these fragmented conditions, you can actually have that inverse, where lower tax rates are associated with higher levels of service provision. And we think, and we're hoping to show in this project and going forward, that this may be an important mechanism by which the place where people live may shape their life outcomes and life trajectories. So social scientists across many disciplines, including in ISR, including myself, have done work describing how where people live or where people grow up shapes their life trajectories. A lot of times the mechanisms that have been studied are social in nature, things like exposure to concentrated poverty, exposure to crime, environmental, things like exposure to toxins. And we think it's also important to look at exposure to local policy conditions and specifically taxation as well. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what we think of, how we're going to think about tax-based fragmentation. So we see it as being related to two other concepts that have been more widely studied in sociology, political science, other disciplines. And these are economic segregation, which is the extent to which rich and poor households live in different areas from one another, often studied across neighborhoods. And the second concept is jurisdictional fragmentation, or the number of distinct local governments, distinct jurisdictions that exist within a metropolitan area. And so these are both, you can see how these both might be related, but we are arguing that they're actually distinct from tax-based fragmentation. And tax-based fragmentation is roughly, can be thought of as being sort of roughly corresponding to the way that economic segregation and jurisdictional fragmentation interact with one another. To look at this, we can consider a stylized example. So this is a figure showing 4 hypothetical metro areas. Each of these has the same population, the same distribution of taxable wealth. So each number is a household where the number corresponds to the property wealth of that household. You can see there's some households with a property wealth of $50, some with 100, some with 200. And these metros vary both on their level of economic segregation and on jurisdictional fragmentation. So in the top left, we have a unfragmented, low segregation metro. And you can see that the numbers are all jumbled together. There's lots of people living next to neighbors who have lower or higher housing wealth than they do. And as a result, everybody's sort of, and in addition, everybody's in the same local government unit. And so this means that there's pretty equal access to services. And in particular, the local government has a mean fiscal resources of $100 per capita. If we skip over to Metro B in the top right, we now see that there's a lot of economic segregation here. All the houses with $100 are on the left, all the houses with $200 are on the right. But again, because everybody's part of the same jurisdiction, this segregation doesn't translate into fiscal disparities in the way that we might be concerned about. So still the overall mean for the metro is $100. The opposite situation is happening in Metro C, where here we have a fragmented metropolitan area. You can see there's 3 different jurisdictions. But because of the low levels of segregation, even though people are living in different jurisdictions from one another, each jurisdiction is sort of roughly economically similar to the other one, and they all have the same mean resources. And it's only when you have the combination of high segregation and high fragmentation, and specifically when the local government boundaries align with patterns of economic segregation, that you see this disparity in fiscal resources. So in Metro D, you can see that we have one town where everybody has $100 of wealth, so its resources per capita are 100, another town with $50, and another town with $200. And so this is a case where we're seeing fiscal inequality as opposed to just segregation or just fragmentation. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about the way that we're going to try to study this in the United States. And it's basically a sort of 3-part analysis. So first, we're going to create a data set where we're going to spatially join data on property values to local government boundaries. Once we've done that, we're going to compute the per capita tax base for each local government in the country. And then we're going to look at variation across local governments and across metropolitan areas. And we're going to look at this variation using 2 key metrics that we develop. So at the jurisdictional level, we're going to calculate what we call the fiscal capacity ratio. And this is just the ratio of property value per capita in that jurisdiction compared to the metropolitan average, the per capita value for the metro area as a whole. And so this is asking how much richer in terms of average property values is this municipality compared to the rest of its metropolitan area. And we want to do this sort of normalization to distinguish the impact of regional economic trends or regional variation in cost of living and house prices from the impact of inequality within the metropolitan area that's being constructed by jurisdictional boundaries. So this is going to be computed for every individual jurisdiction. And then at the metropolitan level, we're going to compute a second quantity that we call the tax-based fragmentation quotient, which is measuring what fraction of all taxable property wealth within the entire metro would have to move across jurisdictional boundaries in order for each jurisdiction to have the same amount of fiscal resources per capita. If you're familiar with studies of residential segregation, this is basically going to be a variant of the dissimilarity index. But instead of measuring the fraction of people that would have to move across neighborhoods, we're measuring the fraction of property wealth that would have to move across jurisdictional boundaries. So it's sort of like a dollar-weighted dissimilarity index. To study this, the data that we're using is from a company called CoreLogic, and actually I think they've now changed their name to Cotality. This is a private company that the University of Michigan has contracted with, and what they do is they aggregate property tax assessment records from across the country. So in most jurisdictions, property tax data is actually public. Like you can go on the City of Ann Arbor website and you can look up any property. You can type in its address and it'll say, here's what the assessed value is, here's what what taxes were paid last year, here's who owns it. But because tax assessment is done separately by county or by jurisdiction, there's about 10,000 different assessing units in the country. It can be difficult to compile a data set. And so what CoreLogic does is they go to all the different tax assessors. Again, in most states that's done at the county level. In some states like Michigan, it's done at the city level. And they gather their data, they do some standardization processes, and they compile it into one nationwide data set. And that's what we're going to be using. So in total, there's about 138 million property records in this data. And our estimate is this is covering about 96% of the US population. There are some assessors where the data are unable, CoreLogic isn't able to get the data, and there's a few more where they don't include geographic information. So for these records, for our data set, we have the exact latitude and longitude of every property of these 138 million records. There is a lot of further data cleaning that we did and that we are doing that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, basically to try to make records from different assessors as comparable as possible, and in particular records from different states comparable to one another. Okay. So the key variable that we're going to be using to measure property wealth is the assessed value for tax purposes. And so this is the official government estimate of the value of every property, or the official government declaration of the value of every property for tax purposes. And this is something that the tax assessors are responsible for calculating. And in different states and different counties, they do it using different methods. But in most cases, it's either based on the price of the most recent sale of a property, or it's based on the price of recent sales for comparable properties nearby, where comparable is determined in different ways by different assessors. One thing that's important to note is that there's been a lot of research, especially in the last few years, describing how the assessed value for tax purposes is not actually that great of a measure of the true market value of a property. And in particular, it tends to be biased upward for low value properties and downward for high value properties, meaning that it essentially inflates the taxable value of lower value properties and deflates the value of higher value properties, essentially resulting in sort of people who own lower value properties paying higher effective tax rates on their investments than people who own higher value properties. So this is, I think, an important limitation of these data that is really important to be studying and has major policy implications. But in this case, as a measure of the fiscal resources available to a given jurisdiction, we actually think that assessed value is maybe the more important quantity to study, because if you're a local government and you're trying to understand how much money you have for your budget, this is the number you have to use. Like, this is the legal declared value of each property. This is the amount that you're going to levy taxes on. So that's one reason why we think that this is a useful quantity to study. A second major data challenge has to do with how do you define a local government. So in the US, there's roughly 90,000 different local governments, and many of them overlap with one another. So, right now I'm standing in the city of Ann Arbor. I'm standing in the Ann Arbor Public School District, which is an entirely separate legal entity. I'm standing in the Ann Arbor Library District, which is another entirely separate legal entity, and then Washtenaw County as well, and probably a couple other ones that I'm forgetting. So there's a lot of different local governments, and they have really different spatial arrangements. And what makes it even more confusing is that each state has its own system of local government. And so there are different entities that exist in different states. And even for ones that exist in many states, like a county, the powers that each county has compared to cities or other types of local governments and the state government might differ. So this is a big challenge for doing sort of comparative work across states on local governments. And deciding on a standard unit of what we're going to define as a local government is a non-trivial question, one that we spend a lot of time on Google and Wikipedia and reading state laws trying to answer. So where we came down and what we're going to present today is basically what we're going to do is we're going to match each property parcel to the smallest general purpose local government that has the power to tax property that it's contained within. So in most cases, this is going to be the municipality or the city, if it's in an incorporated city. So this would, ISR would be assigned to Ann Arbor, the city of Ann Arbor. Other places it will be the town or the village or the county. These are all technical terms that have different meanings in different states, and this all depends on the state. So basically, we're going to try to find the smallest general purpose local government that contains each property. We also do another version of our analysis where we're looking at school districts. So if you look at what types of governments rely on property taxes, it's pretty much about 90% of it is school districts and general purpose governments. So specifically, school districts raised about 40% of all property tax revenue in 2017, and general purpose governments, cities and counties and towns, raised about 52%. So these are the ways we're focusing on. Okay, so now let's talk about what we learned. So I want to start by just looking at an example of what tax-based fragmentation looks like. So this is a map of Metropolitan Detroit. People may be familiar with it. And what I've drawn in are the boundaries of all the general purpose local governments in the metropolitan area. So you can see Detroit itself is down here. We see lots of suburbs in western Wayne County. Ann Arbor would be over here, but we're actually in a different metropolitan area. And then Oakland and Macomb counties up on top. This is Pontiac, Michigan, is this other bigger area. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in properties. So this is now adding in dots representing, each dot represents one property, and the green dots represent the highest value 1% of properties within the metropolitan area, while the purple dots represent the lowest value 1% of properties. And so what you can see in this map is, first of all, there's not a lot of overlap between the green dots and the purple dots, right? This is a fairly segregated metro economically. So in particular, we see, lots of purple dots down here in the city of Detroit, another cluster up in Pontiac, and then most of the green dots are kind of in the middle in Oakland County, especially in this area. There's a couple of exceptions to that. You can see a small cluster of green in downtown Detroit for high value properties, and then in Grosse Pointe on the shore of the lake. But there's not a lot of spatial overlap. And then the other thing that you might notice is that in particular, the patterns of these green and purple dots align fairly closely with the municipal boundaries that I've drawn, right? Like this is really sort of standing out for Detroit itself, and then also for some of these ones up here. So now what I'm going to add is coloring. I'm shading in each jurisdiction by its fiscal capacity ratio. So basically, what is the per capita tax base of this municipality relative to the metropolitan area as a whole? And so what you can see, you see dark red in Detroit and some of the other nearby smaller places, and then dark blue up in the suburbs. I'll take the dots off. And so this is the pattern that you see. And so, again, Detroit itself has a tax base that's only about 30%, the average for the metropolitan area overall, whereas some of these blue areas have tax bases that are 5 or 6 times the metropolitan average. So we're talking about really large, order of magnitude differences in the amount of fiscal resources per capita in terms of taxable property. To put a few more numbers on that, so the city of Detroit, we calculated it up, has about $16 billion of property taxes contained within its city limits. Actually, as a sort of interesting coincidence, the city of Ann Arbor also has about $16 billion of taxable property wealth. So our tax base and the city of Detroit's are identical, more or less, in terms of raw numbers. Of course, Ann Arbor has far fewer residents than Detroit does. So Detroit has about 635,000 people living in it, and that works out to about $25,000 per capita of taxable property wealth in the city. In comparison, if you look at Bloomfield Hills, which is my sort of default for a prosperous suburb of Detroit, it has about 4,400 residents, and it has about a $2.1 billion of property. This should say property wealth, total property wealth, not residential, or about $500,000 per capita. So a 20-fold difference between Detroit and one of the suburbs in terms of the taxable property wealth. And what that means is you can have a situation like what I was describing with the park cities in Dallas. So in Detroit, in 2017, Detroit raised about $250 million of property taxes, and this worked out to a 1.5% tax rate. So everybody was paying, on average, 1.5 of the value of their house or their property to the city government, and that raised $367 of revenue per capita. Conversely, in Bloomfield Hills, the residents were paying about a 0.4% tax rate, so about a third as much in terms of the tax rate they're paying. And that was translating to about $2,100 of revenue, or no, almost $2,200 of revenue. So, far more revenue despite paying far less in property taxes in the tax rate that they're paying. And one thing we want to emphasize is that, Detroit is, I think, famously had a lot of fiscal challenges over the past several years and past several decades even. And a lot of the coverage and discussion, not all of it, but a lot of it, has focused on things like disinvestment and deindustrialization, struggles in the auto industry, these kind of metropolitan or even region of the country challenges, economic conditions. And we want to emphasize that this aspect that we're documenting of the fiscal challenges facing Detroit is separate from all that, right? Because this is about how the taxable wealth that still does exist within the metropolitan area is allocated across jurisdictions. So there, it's not the case that everywhere in Michigan is impoverished or is facing economic challenges, but rather because of the way that jurisdictional boundaries are drawn and because of the way that local governments are funded, this sort of creates these particularly extreme fiscal challenges for cities like Detroit. We can now look at the other end of the spectrum. So to do that, we're going to go out to the Pacific Ocean. This is a map of metropolitan Honolulu, Hawaii. This is the island of Oahu. And I've also put the dots on here for the properties. It's a little bit harder to see the color, but Honolulu also has fairly high levels of economic segregation. If you're able to squint, you would see that the green dots are mostly clustered down here in downtown Honolulu and on the beach, as well as up here on the other beach. And then the purple dots are sort of disproportionately way out on the western sides of the island. So again, fairly high levels of economic segregation. Not quite as bad as Detroit, but just for context, Detroit ranks third out of the 100 or so largest metros, and Honolulu ranks 17th. So still in the very top 20% or so. Okay, now I'm going to add the shading for fiscal capacity ratio, looking at the different local governments. Ready? Go. So some of you may have anticipated this, but this is what it looks like for Honolulu, because in Hawaii, there are no local governments smaller than a county. So the entire island, the entire metropolitan area, is also governed by the county of Honolulu, and is all one local government. And that means that even though there are high levels of economic segregation, in terms of the fiscal capacity of the local governments, it's all going to the same place and everybody's being served by the same county. And so it doesn't have that same fiscal impact that the segregation did in Detroit. So we've done this for the whole country. If you're interested, I'm going to try to do a demo. You can go to tax-based-fragmentation.net. And so what we've done is we've calculated the fiscal capacity ratio for every city. I think it's sort of interesting. New York City is kind of a case a little bit like Honolulu, but that I think helps illustrate the difference between this analysis and other types of spatial analyses focused on spatial disadvantage. So if you're familiar with the New York Metro, you might not be surprised to see that places like Greenwich, Connecticut, Scarsdale, New York, North Shore of Long Island all show up as very advantaged, high tax base per capita, quite affluent. And then there's other parts, especially in New Jersey, Newark, East Orange, some parts of Long Island also show up as disadvantaged. But what you might have noticed is that all of New York City, because it's one local government, is all the same color and has the same fiscal resources per capita. And this is actually, very close to the metropolitan average. And, there is a lot of affluence and a lot of poverty within New York, within the city. But again, because it's all one local government, that doesn't create the same fiscal disparities associated with where people are living within the city that it does in a place like Detroit. Of course, there are still major questions about, is the government serving all neighborhoods equally? But those are potentially addressable through the democratic system of electing mayor and council in a way that it would be very hard to do in the Detroit context, where the wealth is in an entirely separate legal jurisdiction. Also look at we can also look at Ann Arbor. So this is now looking at our metro, and so you can see again some fiscal inequality. So Ann Arbor itself, a lot of times I think people discuss the differences between Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti in terms of affluence and poverty, and also in terms of local governments. And you can see that these show up. Ann Arbor is shaded blue, Ypsilanti is shaded red. But I also think it's worth drawing attention to some of the other jurisdictions. And in particular, you can see here that if you go just north of the city limits, the neighborhood of Barden Hills shows up as really dark blue. And that's actually a separate jurisdiction that has a separate legal existence and doesn't contribute to the Ann Arbor city property taxes, and has about 4 times the tax base per capita. So even in Ann Arbor, we see this kind of fragmentation and inequality both on the high end and on the low end. So if we look across the country, we can calculate the second metric, the tax-based fragmentation quotient. Again, this is showing the total amount of taxable, or the total fraction of all taxable property wealth that would have to move across jurisdictions for there to be fiscal equality. We look at this, we see a fair amount of variation. So there are places like Honolulu, Carson City, I think is Nevada is another one, places that have a value of 0, the minimum possible value. And then on the high end, Detroit is about the highest that a metropolitan area with more than 1 million residents gets. But you can see it gets even higher in some of these places in the interior of the country. And these are sort of interesting cases. A bunch of them are ski resorts. So places like Aspen, where there's one municipality where the vacation homes are, and then there's other municipalities where the workers live. And then a number of these are actually also farming intensive communities where most of the property value is in the farmland and not in the jurisdictions. Beyond those standout values, there's a bit of a regional variation where you sort of, on average, the tax-based fragmentation tends to be higher in the Midwest and the Northeast and a little bit lower in parts of the South in particular. And to return to these other concepts that I was describing earlier about economic segregation and jurisdictional fragmentation, we do actually see that tax-based fragmentation is distinct empirically from both of these. So this is a scatter plotting tax-based fragmentation against residential economic segregation. And there's a positive correlation, but it's only about 0.15, so it's not particularly strong. And same for jurisdictional fragmentation, the number of governments per 100,000 residents. Again, about 0.15, 0.16. So, these are both are related to tax-based fragmentation, but they really are getting at something distinct. Okay. So now I want to zoom in a little bit to look at individual jurisdictions and talk about, on the one hand, places that are, I would say, advantaged by this system of local government funding, and then others that are being disadvantaged by it. So as I was describing a little bit ago, we saw in Metropolitan Detroit, we saw that some municipalities had extremely small tax bases per capita, while others had extremely large tax bases. And actually, if you look a little bit closer, Detroit and Bloomfield Hills aren't the most extreme examples. So in addition to Detroit, we have places like Highland Park, which has $23,000 per capita. Ecorse has about 18,000, and Inkster is down to 16,000, so a third lower than even Detroit itself. And then on the other hand, Lake Angeles is actually, there's a small town that's even more affluent than Bloomfield Hills, with a per capita tax base of about $700,000. This is not a place I knew about before I started this project. And we see examples of this, jurisdictions of both extreme wealth and extreme poverty all around the country. And even in metropolitan areas that on average have relatively low values of tax-based fragmentation. And one thing that's nice about this approach and these data is that we can systematically identify these jurisdictions all across the country all at once, including ones like Angeles for me that weren't even sort of widely known, even potentially to people who live in the area. So we do this, and what we describe first is municipalities of extreme affluence. So what we label as any municipality that has a fiscal capacity ratio above 300%, meaning that it's 3 times as affluent as its metropolitan area. We call these municipal tax havens. And we choose that, that's maybe a bit of a provocative term, but we think it's warranted because these are essentially jurisdictions that are very linked economically to the broader metropolitan area. Oftentimes these are places that, these are bedroom communities where people are working in downtown Dallas or downtown Detroit in the broader metro. And so they're very much benefiting from their metropolitan economy, but they're not fiscally contributing back, right? Because local government revenue is spatially bounded, they can say like, okay, we're our own entity, we're not going to pay taxes to the city of Detroit, even though we're commuting there every day. I should note that the exact 300% threshold we use is somewhat arbitrary. Our goal is here to be high enough to indicate a fundamentally different fiscal reality, we would argue. So we identify more than 502 of these municipal tax havens across the country. In total, they have about 1.8 million residents. And these include some of the ones I've mentioned. So Highland Park, Texas has a fiscal capacity ratio of 992%. So it's almost 10 times as rich as Dallas overall, the Dallas Metro. University Park is about 5 times as rich. And then Bloomfield Hills and Lake Angeles also show up on this list. The largest single one by population is Newport Beach, California, which has about 84,000 residents. So, in general, these tend to be quite, relatively small municipalities, but there's a lot of them, and they exist in many metro areas. Not in every single one, but in many of them. The most extreme municipal tax haven that we identify is Bay Lake, Florida. Has anyone been to Bay Lake, Florida? Let me jog your memory. Has anyone been to Bay Lake, Florida? Yeah. So this is, I think, in the local government law world, this is sort of a famous case, but Walt Disney World is located in its own local government. It actually has two of them, Bay Lake and Lake Buena Vista. These are independent local governments in the Atlanta metro area that contain all of the property for Disney World, all the tax revenue. And Bay Lake has 27 residents. I believe all of them are Disney employees or families of Disney employees. So this is a corporate enclave, essentially, right? Like this is a company-run city that again, because it's it's its own legal entity. It has $7 billion of real estate. I think it's like 200 million per capita. Somebody else can do the math faster than me, probably. Extreme amounts per capita, 240,000% of the metropolitan average for Orlando. So this is a really extreme example of Walt Disney World. And one thing that sort of came up as we were doing this is this idea of a corporate enclave, which we think is really interesting and exists around the country. So another example, this is from maybe 3 weeks ago in the LA Times, is the city of Vernon, California. If people have been to LA, this is independent jurisdiction that's about 5 miles from downtown LA, so it's right near the center. It's a major center of manufacturing in Los Angeles, I think the apparel industry in particular. And during the day, Vernon has about 44,000 people who work within its boundaries in factories. It's also becoming a major AI hub for Southern California. But it only has 200 residents, and all of them are either city employees or families of city employees. So this is like another example of sort of a corporate industrial enclave that is legally separate from the surrounding area, and so doesn't have to share its property taxes. And also, in Vernon's case, a lot of the concern has been about it has its own set of environmental regulations. It has its own set of regulations around power and zoning and that sort of thing. And so, again, sort of like a functioning as a tax shelter for corporate property in this case, as opposed to residential property. And if we do look at this systematically, we find that these corporate enclaves are about 1/5 of all the tax havens that we identify. So we quantify or we document this or delineate this, saying we're gonna call corporate enclaves anyone where less than 25% of the total property tax base is residential, and there's about 100 of them, and they have they're very interesting historically, have a lot of really interesting origins, but they have this consistent pattern where they often have hardly any residents, so sometimes fewer than 10 people living within them, and yet they have hundreds of millions of dollars or even billions of dollars of property wealth that is then is not being taxed by the surrounding areas. Okay. On the other end of the economic scale, we have what we call fiscally impoverished jurisdictions. And so these we define as places that have less than 1/3 of the property tax base per capita as their metropolitan average. So tax havens are 3 times richer. Fiscally impoverished jurisdictions are 3 times poorer, again, compared to their metropolitan area. And we use this term, we call them fiscally impoverished to really highlight that, again, this is their difficult economic conditions or difficult fiscal conditions are stemming from the way that the US fiscal system works and not necessarily from economic patterns or both nationally or even locally. So, right, this is, if the US had a system like the United Kingdom where most of the revenue is coming from the federal government, these would not have fiscal challenges in the way that they do under our system. And again, as I've mentioned before, we also really want to highlight how the difficulties they face are not due to sort of broad patterns of disinvestment or deindustrialization, but rather, again, segregation and our system of finance. To see sort of an example of what we mean by this, we can compare Newark, New Jersey and Youngstown, Ohio. So as I was describing earlier, Newark is part of the New York metropolitan area, and it's in very bad, has lots of recurring fiscal challenges. And this is despite the fact that it's, in one of the, the largest city in the country. It's part of the largest metro area in the country. It's, 5 miles from Wall Street. It's near a lot of affluence, and it's being walled off from that by the way that the boundaries are drawn. And in contrast, Youngstown has fewer resources than Newark in per capita terms, but compared to its metropolitan area, it's not as much of an outlier. And so I would say that the fiscal challenges facing Youngstown are sort of more a question of like regional disinvestment and economic decline, whereas those in Newark are more about how the wealth that does exist is being allocated across governments. So in total, we identify about 920 of these jurisdictions across the country, and they have about 3.7 million residents. These ones are more spatially concentrated in the Northeast and Midwest, whereas the tax havens are more spread out. The largest ones by population are Detroit itself, and Newark, and then some other ones, Paterson, New Jersey, Bridgeport, Connecticut, and Lawrence, Massachusetts are sort of the other relatively large ones that we see. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about local government revenue. So far I've been talking about inequality between jurisdictions in fiscal resources, which I've defined as the property tax base per capita. So this is looking at inequality in what resources exist that could be taxed. But then you might be wondering, like, does this actually translate in, or how does this, whether this does actually translate into inequality in local government budgets and in revenue? And so to look at this, this is a challenging, sort of even more challenging causal argument to make. So we're just going to be looking at some associations. But we're going to test this by looking at revenue data for each municipality from the US Census of Governments. So this is a data set that the Census Bureau puts together where they ask each jurisdiction in the country, all 90,000 local governments, what's your total budget? Where is that revenue coming from? What are you spending it on? There's some potential challenges with this data that I'm happy to talk about, but it's it's certainly the only thing that's close to universal in terms of studying local government budgets. And we're going to just do some really basic descriptive regressions with fixed effects for state and metropolitan area. So essentially, we're asking, compared to other municipalities in your same state, so your same political institutional context, and then also in your same metropolitan area, so your same economic conditions. Do municipalities that have larger tax bases derive, and then we're going to ask two questions: more total revenue, so more dollars per capita from a given source, and then also we're going to look at a greater share of their revenue from a given source, so a greater percentage of their revenue. So when we do this, we see a couple of different things. So if we first look at the total revenue being raised, and these are logged regressions, so log of tax base per capita on log of revenue per capita on the right-hand side. We can see the coefficient is about 0.25, meaning that a 1% increase in tax base is associated with about 0.25% increase in local government revenue. So on average, places that have larger tax bases do in fact have larger revenue, which I shouldn't be super surprising. But interestingly, it is quite a bit below 1, right? So it's not translating 1 for 1. Instead, people are choosing to sort of take more of that tax base in essentially lower tax rates or lower payments. And if we specifically look at taxes and property taxes, we see that the coefficient is about 0.4 for each of those. So basically, on average, a 1% increase in tax base translates into a 0.5% increase in property taxes, a 0.4% increase in property taxes, property tax revenue. So these places are sort of taking half of their additional resources in tax break and half of it in additional revenue, more or less. We can also look at intergovernmental transfers. So one thing that we often are asked about is like, well, what about, we do have some transfers from state governments and from the federal government, and some states have pretty explicit redistributional goals with these transfer programs, especially around school funding. Do these compensate for the lower tax bases? And we find that basically they don't. So if you look at the total income intergovernmental revenue from the federal government and from state governments, we see that the coefficient is negative, meaning that transfers on average are going to poorer places or places with lower tax bases, but it's only 0.07. So it's about less than 1/10 of the change. So a 1% decrease in tax base, you do get more more transfers from the state and federal government, but you only get about 0.1% more transfers, so nowhere near enough to compensate. And in particular, we see that federal transfers actually are quite redistributional. The coefficient is about -0.8, so that actually is coming close to compensating. But state government, which is much more important as a source of transfers, is not. So that's really the reason that there's not as much of an overall compensating effect. And so what are people relying on? What are poor areas relying on instead? It looks like they're relying on charges for, especially for utilities and services, and then also on fines and forfeitures. So if you look at the share of revenue coming from these different sources, you can see that places with lower tax bases derive a greater share of their revenue from utility payments and also from fines and fees. So this is sort of one way in which they're compensating. Okay, so now just to sum up. So what we've seen, in US metros, there is substantial inequality across local government jurisdictions when it comes to fiscal capacity. And I want to emphasize again, this is important because of the US system, right? This is not a universal phenomenon. In other countries, it wouldn't have the same consequences. But under the US system, this leads to, or I will say likely leads to inequality in the ability to provide services. But we also see that there's a lot of variation across metros in the extent to which the economic segregation that exists aligns with these jurisdictional boundaries and creates this fiscal inequality. We've also been able to identify specific municipalities that seem to most benefit or be most harmed by this system of local revenue generation. And we've also seen that municipalities with larger tax bases do have more total revenue and seem to be more dependent on property taxes and less on transfers and utility charges. There's other work that we're hoping to do soon and that we hope that maybe other people in this room will think about doing. So we're starting to look at racial disparities in property taxes using the same data and looking at how racial segregation across jurisdictions creates this sort of additional mechanism of inequality in the form of paying different tax rates and receiving different levels of government services. I think there's also a lot of really interesting work to be done on the taxation of commercial property because this tends to be much more spatially concentrated within metropolitan areas than residential property wealth. And then there's also the question of what can states and cities do about this? And this is something that especially my colleagues who are in law schools are starting to think more about is like, are there changes we can make either to state annexation laws, think about like city-county mergers or state funding formulas that can try to compensate for some of these inequalities. And then we're hoping that other people will also have their own ideas. So the data that we've been using at the municipal level are posted on this tax-basedfragmentation.net website. I'm hoping to put them on ICPSR soon. I feel like I should have done that before this talk. But in the meantime, you can check out the maps that I was showing at tax-basedfragmentation.net. Okay, thank you everyone. And yeah, excited to talk a little bit more. Nope. Yeah, go for it. The mics are going to turn off and on.
Oh, okay. Yeah. This was awesome. I to get a better idea of how some of these metrics were measured, I wanted to return to the Honolulu example. Was that a measure that you got because Honolulu, the local government of the county, are contiguous, or because it's the only local government in that entire metropolitan area? Because I don't think you'd get that same relationship with something like San Francisco, right? That's contiguous city and county.
Yes, it's the second one. So Honolulu doesn't have a city government; it's just a county. San Francisco is a combined city and county government. But in the San Francisco metro, there are lots of other local governments, whereas in Honolulu there aren't. The entire island, which is also the entire metropolitan area, is all just under one.
Question and a comment. Question is, if in the first 30 slides or so, we have residential property only, which includes rental but doesn't include business. Is that correctly or not?
So I think that was a lack of clarity in the slide. So this analysis that I'm talking about is all properties, commercial and residential both.
The non-residential comes from someplace other than CoreLogic?
No, it's in CoreLogic too.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's cool. I did not know that.
Yeah, and it's non-residential is like commercial property, agricultural, industrial. I forget if there's any other things, but basically, we think all property that is assessed by tax assessors should be in the data. We take out ones that are exempt, which are labeled. Most are labeled. We had to label some ourselves. And then we include everything else.
Very cool. Just a comment. One reason this will be very hard to fix is that, to a large extent, not perfectly, the people who live in these fancy neighborhoods with the low tax rates have paid for that. Okay, if the property tax is less in one jurisdiction than another, people will bid for properties in that jurisdiction. And so a lot of the gains associated with this terrible system accrue to the people who own the property 30 years ago and their heirs. And the people who live there now, to an approximation, may not actually be making any profits on this terrible system at all. So when you take it away from them, they're going to be extremely unhappy.
Yeah. No, I think this is a challenge. And I mean, I think it's leading me towards, I'm not sure that if it is going to be solved, that the way it's going to be done is to like allow Detroit to annex Bloomfield Hills, because I think that's going to create a lot of political difficulties. And so I think maybe the more promising route is through sort of thinking differently about what levels of government are funding what. And in particular, I mean, there's been just a little bit of, I think, really interesting work being done on the American Rescue Plan Act during COVID gave lots of unrestricted funding to local governments from the federal government, and that they use for all sorts of, in some cases, seemingly quite impactful uses. And so I think that's sort of a way that we could think about is like, you can reduce the consequences of this fragmentation without necessarily undoing the fragmentation itself. And I wonder if that might be more feasible, though it has its own challenges for sure. Yeah.
I think an example of that, which is interesting in its own right, but also illustrative of issues, school finance reform. Because in Michigan, but also in a lot of other states, much of the financing of schools has gone to the state government, and then they distribute it so that is meant as an equalization. But then that raises various issues that I'm vaguely familiar with in Michigan, but also in California, whereas you sort of have a unwillingness. I mean, it creates a variety of problems, including limits on how much state funding there is because people don't want to cross-subsidize. Anyway, it's kind of there's a case study in a way of when you attempt to move the funding up level.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And like a lot of times when we first talk about this project, people are like, oh, like you mean like schools? And it's like, we have to say, actually there were big reforms and schools are no longer as locally funded as a lot of people think. And one thing that I want to do more learning about is like, what were the beneficial consequences of that? And then what were the unforeseen ones? Yeah.
But those things were at the state level. Have comparisons. I mean, all the endogenous states how successful election. I have a different question. I'm focusing on places where I know a little bit, like New York City, dramatically, as you illustrated, dramatically different. Is there an explanation, or is this an accident, or what? I mean, and these must have been happening at roughly the same time, maybe Detroit a little later, but New York City became a city we know and hate or love, depending on who you are, around the turn of the century. I don't know, most recent century, the last one. And Detroit would have become whatever it is around the time of the development of the automobile.
So yes, it's a good question. I think in general, I would say it's like there's sort of some accidents of history and then people reacting to those strategically. So a lot of what we see is that, there was a period, I would say like in the late 19th century, late 1800s, where a lot of major cities did big annexations. And so like this is when New York consolidated with Brooklyn and the 5 boroughs. This is when Chicago did a lot of its growing, a few other places. And then that was essentially came to a stop, and states passed laws making it much harder to annex neighboring towns and villages. And so, and then in the sort of 50 years later, when the Sun Belt was being developed, you had at first, again, sort of easier annexation potential. So places like Houston, places like Phoenix are very large in the city proper. And then that I think maybe has slowed down a little bit. So I think there is sort of a timing of like when the growth happened, and Detroit is maybe a little bit later than New York in terms of not having quite as much potential to annex. But then it's like once these boundaries are fixed, and especially once it's hard to annex and it's very hard to change them, then you definitely have these sort of competitive dynamics or like strategic dynamics where people with the resources to move are saying, we are going to leave this big city and take our wealth and sort of put it in a smaller pool where we don't have to cross subsidize as much. And so that's then creating some of the patterns that we see. That would be sort of my general sense.
Could you talk a little bit about overlapping taxing entities? A village in Michigan is taxed by the village, by the township, and by the county.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if we're getting some sort of, it's not really intergovernmental transfers, but we're being taxed more uniformly at the county level, and that might be redistributed in a different way than other things.
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's something that is challenging to like has been a challenge for us to try to really nail down. So there's lots of different levels of local government that can tax property. In particular, most places there's both a city and a county, and the county is much bigger geographically. And so I would say that means that some of the things that I'm showing you are sort of like a upper bound, probably. Like we're looking at the smallest variation, though we see similar patterns. Well, no, actually, so one of the analyses that we do is looking at school districts, like I said. And so there are parts of the country where school districts are much larger than cities, and those we see much less fragmentation there, which would mean that, if you're thinking about you could think about it like a revenue-weighted fragmentation index or something, which would kind of give a better estimate of the overall effect. But I would say that these are important dynamics, and there are things that we are still, I think, trying to figure out how exactly to best portray.
Okay. I had a question, especially with some of the results where you talk about like really trying to nail this down as like a sort of like some ways a policy choice versus like overall economic conditions. Have you been able to do similar analysis at the commuting zone level rather than metro area? Because I wonder, like, I sometimes worry that metro areas themselves are a little bit like, they're decided by the federal government, right? Designated by the, I think, OMB. But commuting zones might be give you a better idea of like the economic activity. Because I think, like you mentioned, Ann Arbor wouldn't be in Detroit's metropolitan area, but it would be in its commuting zone. And Ann Arbor, I think, is like part of the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Southeast Michigan. So I think like I guess it's a unit problem there. And I wonder if commuting zone might be better able to like tease out this like political versus economic mechanism.
So this is a good question. So the short answer is yes, we do look at this by commuting zone, and the broad patterns are pretty similar. The longer answer is to get on my soapbox, and I actually don't like commuting zones very much. They're basically, this is another way, they're trying to do the same thing as metropolitan areas, but it seems like they essentially place a greater weight on having about the same number of counties in each commuting zone. So they like are usually about 5 or 6 counties, whereas metros place a bigger weight on trying to like really capture all of the different commuters, and whether that means a big one or a small one. So, I mean, the go-to example is that Newark is not in the New York City commuting zone, which I think is like not my experience of how New York City and New Jersey are related to each other. So that's my soapbox answer.
Yeah. This is a poorly formed question, and I think you have a sense of where I'm going with this is, how to think about this quotient number as, as outcome of long historical process and potentially input into what, right? So, is this measure kind of just like picking up on like a fiscal possibilities, or are you guys thinking about this quotient as, a potential independent variable for future dynamics? That is, does it pick up on something about the vibrancy, like conflict of politics in these places, like, you know, because it can just be, you know, these folks got this amount of money and they got that amount of money to do whatever. But I think it's also, given the Detroit example, it does seem to be something political and kind of conflictual with respect to maybe define the possibilities of municipal change in these different places. Like, how are you guys thinking about this quotient number, you know, beyond just a reflection of, you know, the dollars across space?
Thanks for that. And actually, so I would say we've been thinking about it, you know, a lot as an outcome, and then we've been thinking about like the tax base of each jurisdiction as an input into lots of things like, you know, ability to fund services for their residents, potential, you know, consequences for people who live there. But I hadn't really thought about doing it. Yeah, like you could also think at the metro level. I could totally imagine this would be a good index of like some potential for conflict between cities and suburbs or between different jurisdictions. I like that idea a lot. Yeah.
Great. Please join me in thanking Robert